How much damage can hyperinflation do to a country? If you search the globe for economic meltdowns, Lebanon is high on the list. The country has seen its currency lose 90% of its value against the US dollar in just 2 years. A government paralyzed by infighting and factionalism has done little to make life easier. Add that all up and you get this.
Fury on the streets of Beirut. Lebanon is descending fast into an economic crisis that the World Bank says will likely rank among the world's worst of the last 150 years.
There was no growth and there was no sign of hope.
It's the biggest Ponzi schemes in modern history.
Finally, catastrophe.
Recently, thousands hit the streets of Beirut to commemorate last year's port blast. The disaster has come to symbolize the government's failure and a society that is ready to explode. That failure can be measured with the long lines for fuel, medical supplies, and food. At the start of the crisis, 18 months ago, $1 bought 1,500 Lebanese lira. Now it buys 16,000. Average workers are making the same, while prices for basic necessities have soared. Before the crisis, Lebanon's minimum wage was $450 a month. Today, it's less than 50. But how did Lebanon get here? The Lebanon Economic Monitor, which is affiliated with the World Bank, found two things. There was a lack of political consensus over effective policy initiatives and a lack of understanding on how to prevent a bankrupt economic system, which benefited a few for so long. Last year, Lebanon defaulted on its sovereign debt, and now its central bank says it's effectively ending fuel subsidies. So when you mix a country that is heavily dependent on imports and then cut government handouts, you get the perfect recipe for hyperinflation.
In normal days, less than a couple years ago, those would have been worth around 40,000 liras, which is around $30. Let's see how much are those worth today. What should have been at most 40,000 Lebanese liras today is worth 180,000 Lebanese liras. Tomorrow, it'll be more.
But Lebanon is far from an outlier. Over the last 2 decades, other countries have seen their currencies plummet and their economies crumble. Take Venezuela, which is the nightmare scenario Lebanon could be headed towards. At last check, $1 bought over 4 million Venezuelan bolivars.
Venezuelan bolivars. Did you know that a single sheet of toilet paper is worth more than the most expensive bill?
This is an example of the inflation rates in Venezuela. All of this money is barely $4.
Venezuela's economy was once the envy of the world. It has the largest proven reserves of oil at 300 billion barrels. That puts it ahead of Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich Gulf states. In 1950, it had the world's 4th highest GDP per capita. But today, it's one of the poorest and most dangerous, where hunger and crime are being fueled by an economic crisis with no end in sight. Basking in high oil prices a decade ago, then President Hugo Chavez lavished the country with generous subsidies, redistributing Venezuela's oil wealth to the masses. But after oil prices collapsed and sanctions were imposed on Venezuela's oil sector, the cash soon dried up. Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, wasn't ready to cut that government lifeline many Venezuelans depended on. His solution was to print more money, and that led to one of the world's worst cases of hyperinflation. In 2019, the country had the world's highest inflation rate when it peaked at nearly 283,000%. Although not as drawn out as Venezuela's crisis, Zimbabwe had a record of its own. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, Zimbabwe recorded the second highest record of hyperinflation in history, with the November rate hitting 79 billion%. Prices in the country nearly doubled every day, causing chaos at food markets and gas stations. But Zimbabwe's economic troubles stretched years back. It was suffering from rising national debt, decline in exports due to poor crop yields, and political corruption. The solution? Print more money. Then President Robert Mugabe increased the money supply, but all that did was send prices skyrocketing. To keep up, the government had to introduce a $100 trillion note. The solution was unbearable, and the printing presses were eventually turned off in 2009. The use of foreign currency became the temporary solution. So we've seen some prime examples of hyperinflation. Although all three countries are scattered across the globe, they all had one thing in common.
These are kleptocrats at the end of the day. What's happening today in Lebanon, I call mafia economics. These politicians and policymakers are holding Lebanon and the Lebanese hostage. The only language I think they will understand is personal sanctions on their own fortunes, on their deposits, on their assets outside. Once you do that, perhaps they will be forced into taking action to rescue the economy and the Lebanese.
So there you have it. The main factor fueling hyperinflation is government mismanagement. It's when politicians think that the laws of math don't apply to them and that a printer can solve their problems.